I'm Gabriella, this is Didion, and this is Digital Spy's YouTube channel. Today we are delving into a little list I've curated of the best films, TV shows, and documentaries to watch if you want to learn a little bit more about Jewishness. This list is by no means exhaustive, but I think what it does is shows a really good cross-section of all the different types of stories that make up what it means to be Jewish. So we'll just dive right in. Disobedience. Disobedience is based on a novel, and it tells the story of a young woman named Ronit who returns to her North London Orthodox Jewish community for the funeral of her father, who was a rabbi there. And the story is really as much about Judaism as it is about love. There is a relationship between Ronit and her childhood friend Esti that is explored again in present day when Ronit returns for the funeral. And what Disobedience does, I think, so well is presents the Orthodox community without judgment, but not without criticism. And the whole film is really a story about how you reckon with yourself when you don't fit in the community that you are a part of, or when you feel like you don't fit in the community you're a part of. And because it's a story both at the same time about Jewishness, but also about being part of the LGBTQ community, it really examines what it means to live at the cross sections of those identities when they're in conflict with each other. It's so beautifully acted, and it's also really a glimpse into a closed-off community in North London of Orthodox Jews. Because it was written so authentically, there's no ulterior motive in the way that this story is presented. It is presented to tell a fundamental truth, which is something that so many people experience about not feeling like you fit in, or being ostracized from your community or your family, and how painful it can be to return to that, but also how kind of healing it can be when you go through the work of figuring out who you are and how you fit. A Serious Man and Uncut Gems. So we've put these two in the list together, and it's actually not our idea. I was inspired to this comparison by Jewish Currents, who in their discussion of Uncut Gems brought up A Serious Man. Both of these films are films about Jewish characters, and they're both made by Jewish brothers. The Coen brothers made A Serious Man, and the Safdie brothers made Uncut Gems starring Adam Sandler. Both films tell very similar stories on opposing trajectories, and both main characters are Jews, and their Jewishness is sort of integral to their stories, more so for A Serious Man than maybe Uncut Gems, but it's so interesting because the characters themselves represent so well some tenets of Jewishness, the idea of fate and the idea of control, and how much control you have over your destiny, and how much do you have to kind of defer to things that have happened to you in the past to dictate what will come. Angels in America. So Angels in America is a play by Tony Kushner, but the version that we're going to talk about is the 4-part miniseries made by HBO. Firstly, it is an unbelievable cast. Patrick Wilson, Meryl Streep, Al Pacino, Mary Louise Parker, Jeffrey Wright. It's full of incredible actors, and it's brilliant. So regardless of anything else we have to say about it, you should watch it because it's so good. For the purposes of this list, Angels in America takes place in the 80s in New York, and it's really about the AIDS crisis at the time. But it's also a very Jewish story because so many of the characters have either direct relationships to Jewishness or kind of tangential relationships to Jewishness. In particular, there's a character he's Jewish, and he leaves his partner when he discovers that his partner has HIV. And he spends a lot of time reckoning that with himself. And so much of the series is built around the idea of fate, responsibility, identity, and where all those things meet. You have characters that are dealing with real high stakes in terms of life and death, and whether they've got HIV or not. It's literally, I'm speechless about it. It's just beautiful and moving. Menashe. Menashe is a film by Joshua Z. Weinstein about a man named Menashe who is a widower, and in his Orthodox community in Brooklyn, it is required that he remarries before he can regain custody of his young son. The film is stunning. It is truly a sort of fly-on-the-wall film. It's not a documentary, but the whole cast is made up of the real people that live in this community in Borough Park in Brooklyn, in this Hasidic community. And its star, Menashe Lustig, is himself a Hasidic Jewish man. And the story is actually sort of loosely based around him. The movie, like Disobedience, presents a view of the Orthodox Jewish community in a non-judgmental way, but again, in a critical way, because the characters themselves have criticisms of the communities that they're part of. And the story itself unfurls all that for you. You don't have to do that work. It's not your job to make those judgments. You get to just be immersed in their world, in their stories. And it's, in particular with Menashe, I think what's so universal about it is, I think whether you're a parent or not, you can empathize with that love, that unconditional love that he has for his son, and that he will do whatever it takes to get him back. That's something that I think we all can relate to. If we haven't experienced it ourselves, we've seen it enough times in film, we know what that's like. And so to take that story and place it so necessarily in that community, it's just such an intertwined story. And it's in Yiddish. I mean, like, it's a truly authentically made film of fiction. It blends those two things so well. Drunk history. So Drunk History, which feels like a bit of a deviation from the list, they have an episode about a woman named Rose Valland, who is a curator at a museum in France during World War II. And the episode is presented by Tiffany Haddish, who is an amazingly funny actress and comedian in and of herself. And she reveals in the episode that she is Jewish. She's a Jew-Jo. Her father's Jewish and her mother is a Jehovah's Witness. So you've got these two things kind of going on at the same time. On the one hand, you've got this very kind of Jewish story about a woman subverting the Nazi regime, who are destroying art and culture and looting Jewish families' possessions. But on the other hand, you have a woman presenting this show who herself has a tie to that. You know, ancestrally, Jews are connected, right? So she has this link to this story, and also as a reminder that Jews are a broad and diverse group of people, and we have intermarried, and there's patrilineal Jews, and there's converted Jews. And I think by having her present this story, it's just a little kind of nice, subtle reminder that you can't ever assume anything of anyone. And also, it's just absolutely hilarious and totally worth watching. BlacKkKlansman. So BlacKkKlansman is Spike Lee's Oscar-winning film, I love saying that, based on the true story of Ron Stallworth, who is the first African-American cop in the Colorado Springs Police Department. And one of the things he does is infiltrate the KKK, but not without a little help from his partner. In real life, I don't think his partner was Jewish, and I don't really know that much about his real life partner. But in the film, Spike Lee made the choice to create the character of Flip Zimmerman, played by Adam Driver, who is not Jewish, but the character of Flip is. And it's very important to the story because even though the film is not a Jewish tale, by choosing to make Flip Jewish, it brings in this other element that I think, for me personally, resonated really clearly. There's a moment in the film where Flip says that he never really had to think about his Jewishness. He never had to reckon with his identity. And while it's definitely a controversial take within kind of other Jews that I've talked with about this, for me it was really powerful. And obviously there's a privilege that comes with not having to think too in depth about who you are and your place in society. But I think what that moment does is it reminds white Jews in particular that there is a level of interrogation you have to do about how you fit into a white supremacist system, right? We live in a world that is built on white supremacy and values that above all else. And white Jews fit in that very carefully, precariously, I should say. There's always a caveat to the benefit that we get from white supremacy. And Flip's monologue in that, I think, sparks that internal reckoning that I think a lot of people go through, regardless of whether it's about you're Jewish or whatever. We do all at some point have to think critically about how we define ourselves and who we are and how we fit in that system. And another moment in the film that really spoke to me was when Ron says to Flip, "Don't pretend like you don't have skin in this game." And that was so important because I think, again, for white Jews, it is upon us to stand up for equality, right? To stand up for justice. Fig Tree. Fig Tree tells the story of a young Ethiopian Jewish girl who tries to prevent her Christian boyfriend from being drafted during the Ethiopian Civil War. It is first and foremost a love story. It's a story about young people who will do anything to stay together. But it also tells a story that doesn't get as much kind of Hollywood attention, which is the plight of Ethiopian Jews, which is still going on. And it's not something that's necessarily given the kind of, like I said, the Hollywood treatment. It's not a story that is told in that way, but it should be, because it's worth having that spotlight shone on it. In particular, Fig Tree, it centers the story in the lives of these young people who are on the brink of this kind of really big change. So not only is her boyfriend being drafted, but she's and her family are preparing to leave for Israel. So there's a lot of questions about identity and love and what it means to call somewhere home. And all of those themes are universal, right? We all kind of experience those feelings and those questions. So Fig Tree is just another telling of that story that's centered in a place, in a time, with people that we don't often get seen represented in film in this way. And so for that reason, combined with the fact that it, again, like all these other stories, is just good, is definitely makes it worth watching. The Passengers. The Passengers is a documentary about two young men from Ethiopia who traveled to New York to tell the Jewish community about the last 9,000 Jews in Ethiopia who are still waiting to be brought to Israel. And it is an unbelievably moving documentary. It centers this story on the very people who it affects. It is Demos and Gezi, it is their story, it is their community, and the documentary hands them the mic. And I think that's so important, because the times when the story of Ethiopian Jews is told, the kind of, other than Fig Tree, which we've mentioned, one of the big films that goes into the story of this community is Netflix's Red Sea Diving Resort, which is not bad, but it definitely centers the story on the white Mossad agents who were there in real life, were there to help. They were not the instigators, they were not the kind of driving force, it was the community themselves, and there were people who really instigated this movement of rescuing themselves. And the characters in that, who are played by Chris Evans in a beard with Stark David, I mean, come on. That's all well and good, but I think what The Passengers does, which is so important, and by virtue of being a documentary, is it makes sure that the narrative is told by the people who experience it. It is so authentic, and it is so moving for that reason, because it also reminds us that we are more connected than we realize. Particularly in the Jewish culture, we talk a lot about our ancestors and our history. That goes beyond just your genetic link to your past. It is a bigger collective, and it includes these other communities of Jews all over the world. By bringing Demos and Gezi to New York and seeing them interact with other Jews, it just reminds you that there is that common thread. There is that thing that brings us together. At the same time, without getting too much into the politics of these different nations, it holds to account the politicians who said, yes, we'll help you, and have not held up their end of that bargain. It does not pull any punches where that's concerned. And I think, again, it's a documentary, it can do that, and it's important that it does. It is the responsibility of others to help and to keep up their promises. Denial. Rachel Weisz makes her second appearance on this list as Deborah Lipstadt in Denial, which is also based on a true story of Deborah Lipstadt, who is one of the foremost Holocaust experts. And in the 90s, she wrote a book talking about Holocaust denial. And a few years after it was published, she was sued for libel by a British historian who claimed that she ruined his career when she cited him in this work about Holocaust denial. And because the trial takes place in England, it is on the onus to prove that the Holocaust existed, and therefore the libel claim doesn't hold up. That burden is on her. So a big undertaking, right? The film itself as a movie is really, really good. It's really tight, it's really tense, it's got a great cast. Andrew Scott is in it as well. And you really feel the stakes, and you feel the emotion without it being overwrought or melodramatic, which I think sometimes some materials that deal with elements of the Holocaust narrative can be. This is not that. This is about the survivors telling their stories, and it's about proving what it has been proved, right? What it does on another level is it really highlights how Holocaust denial is a big tool in the arsenal of anti-Semites and racists. It is used to reframe the conversation about really kind of human impact, right, in an academic, philosophical way. It becomes like, oh, we're not talking about real people who were killed. We're talking about this kind of academic, theoretical, philosophical thing. But that's not true. And it wasn't just Jews who were killed in the Holocaust. It was LGBTQ people and Romani people and disabled people. And so you have this event that is so all-encompassing for so many people, and to deny that it ever happened in an academic setting, it just is something that shouldn't be done. And the movie is really good at reminding us of that without it being, without feeling like it's overwhelming you with that narrative. And I think a lot of that is down to Rachel Weisz's acting, but I think it's also down to the way that the story is presented. And I think if you're not looking for that, you might not notice it, but you'll come away with that feeling anyway. It's a very subtle theme within the film, but I think it's really important. And also, we love watching Rachel Weisz. I'll watch her do anything. Resistance. Resistance stars Jesse Eisenberg as the famed French mime artist Marcel Marceau. And until I saw this film, I had no idea that Marcel Marceau was a key figure in the French Resistance. And so I went into this movie, firstly surprised that there was this information that I had yet to learn, and secondly, really moved by the way it was presented. As we just said, sometimes with Holocaust narratives, there's an emphasis put on the gruesomeness of it. And this is not that. This is a story of the will to survive. Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, again, tonally maybe a little bit of a shift, it's a great musical comedy series on Netflix, created by and starring Rachel Bloom, and the series is really fun. We recommend it anyway, but there is definitely a very Jewish kind of thread that runs through it. In particular, there's a song that takes place toward the latter bit of the series called Remember That We Suffered, and it takes place during an episode where Rebecca brings Josh, her boyfriend, home for a celebration, and there's a moment where they sing this song, Remember That We Suffered, to the tune of Hava Nagila, which is a popular Jewish folk song. And what's so ironic about it is that Remember That We Suffered is all about how you can have fun and dance and drink and eat, but also remember that we suffered, which is so much of what the kind of Jewish memory is about, reminding us of the things that our ancestors went through. But also, what's ironic about it is that Hava Nagila is actually a very uplifting song. It's like, smile, arise, awake, we're happy, hooray. It's a much more positive song. So you really have this interesting dichotomy there. And it also reflects, underneath it, the idea that there is also an individual onus on us to make the best of our lives. And there's a moment after the song where she's talking to her rabbi, who's played by Patti LuPone, who isn't Jewish. And Patti LuPone says something like, your life is your responsibility. So yes, we honor our ancestors, we honor our story, we honor our heritage, but we in the end have to choose to do what's right, to choose to do the best that we can, both in terms of our own happiness, but also in terms of how we preserve our legacy and how we move forward, which is just a theme in the show. Yes, it's a theme of Jewishness, but it's a theme for Rebecca, who's also dealing with mental health issues that mean that she's constantly questioning how much she has control over in her life. In her relationships with other people. So it really teases out these different themes and shows how they can be universal. They're not just unique to being Jewish or unique to having mental health issues or unique to another faith. They're something that we all kind of have to think about. And what's great about Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is it does all this in a comedy. It does all this in a musical comedy series. And that, I think, is a great way of getting people to think about stuff without making it feel tedious, without making it feel like a chore. And Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is so good at that. Unorthodox. Unorthodox follows the story of a young woman named Esty who leaves her Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn and escapes to Berlin. And the story is loosely based around the real life of a woman named Deborah Feldman, who consulted on the series, not in an official capacity, but was a part of its development. And she's talked about the fact that what they wanted to do with the story was they wanted to make it a universal experience so that people who weren't Esty herself or didn't look like her or didn't have that same experience could still relate. And I think that's so important and one of the reasons why Unorthodox was so successful is not only was it a glimpse into a community that is otherwise very secluded and sheltered, but it also is broader than that community, and it really offers you a chance to examine what it's like to feel like you don't fit in your community and the lengths you'll go to find a place where you do fit in, and then how you reconcile that within yourself. It's a really well encapsulated story. It's definitely worth watching. We can't recommend it highly enough. Remember Baghdad. So Remember Baghdad is a documentary about Baghdad and the Jewish community there, but also the multicultural community there. And it really shines a light on a community of Jews that often doesn't get the same kind of attention, which are the Mizrahi Jews. And Remember Baghdad does a really good job also at showing how precarious multicultural communities can be. And it also reminds us that it is important to do our work to preserve those communities. The Last Sephardic Jew. So The Last Sephardic Jew also shines a light on another community of Jews that doesn't often get the Hollywood treatment, which are Sephardic Jews. And Sephardic Jews were Jews expelled from Spain in the late 1400s. I'm not a historian. And the documentary follows a young rabbi who sort of makes a reverse diaspora pilgrimage. And he starts in Israel and he goes back, retracing the steps of this diaspora to Toledo, to kind of discover the root of these Jews who were expelled from Spain. And what I think, this was one of those documentaries that's going to be interesting for everybody, but I think it's especially interesting for Jewish people because it shows facets of a culture that is part of who we are, but also different to who we are. And it's worth thinking about all the different ways that Jews exist and live in the world, from language to food to music, and how we can kind of revel in the multiculturalness of Jewishness, and also examine historically why Jews ended up the places that they did. So it does a lot of things at once. It is an older documentary, so if you're someone who needs things to be in 4K, you might be a bit frustrated with this one, but it's definitely worth watching if you're at all curious about history, about movements of peoples in general. It's super interesting and you'll learn a lot. They Ain't Ready for Me. They Ain't Ready for Me is a documentary about a woman named Tamar Manasseh, who is a Black rabbinical student in Chicago. The trailer's gorgeous, and everything about this woman is absolutely humbling and incredible. And the documentary talks about, as a broad overview, her life and all of the things that make up who she is, and her movement. And her movement is called MASK. It stands for Mothers Against Senseless Killings. And together with other people in this group, they occupy street corners in Chicago that have seen an upswing in violence. And her calling to do something about the violence she's seeing in her community is one of the kind of pillars of her relationship to her Jewishness. She talks a lot in the documentary, but also in interviews she's given about all these different complex elements of who she is and how they all relate together and how they have made her into the woman she is that does all these incredible things. And I can't think of anyone who would watch this trailer in anticipation of the film and not feel humbled by who she is and the choices she's made to do with her life. It's just totally incredible and awe-inspiring. Underneath that, there's another frustrating element to it, which is that she's often kept at arm's length by the traditional white Jewish establishment in Chicago. I think the documentary does a good job at reminding us that, Jews, as all of these other things have also said, are not one thing. Jews are diverse and they are multilingual and multicultural, and there's so many ways you can be Jewish and so many different types of Jews out there that you can't kind of hold the gates against certain people because they don't fit what you think a Jew should be. She is the epitome of what a Jew should be. and how they should move through their life. So that's our list. We have some honorable mentions. David Baddiel's The Infidel, Yentl, the pianist. And then goes without saying, you've got Schindler's List and you've got The Jazz Singer. Those are all worth watching. But we hope that you enjoy the list. We hope you managed to get through it. If there's anything we missed and you wanted us to have included, let us know in the comments, make suggestions, tell us what you think. And if you want more glorious at-home content, you can always like and subscribe to Digital Spy's YouTube channel for more of this. But for now, it's it from me. That's it from Haiti. Thanks for watching.